Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Ansel Augustine from the Archdiocese of Washington. And on behalf of the National Black Catholic Congress, I want to welcome you to this webinar presentation. We are glad to have you with us today. Before we start the webinar, let us take a moment for prayer. Next slide, please. I invite you to recite this prayer with me in your own space. A prayer for those suffering from domestic violence from the Archdiocese of Chicago Domestic Violence Outreach Program. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. For women and men who are victims of domestic violence, may God help them be freed from abuse and live safely in the peace of Christ. For women who are suffering physically, emotional, economic, or sexual abuse in their own homes, may they find strength and be freed from the violence and live in peace. For all men and women who abuse their partners, whether physically, emotionally, economically, or sexually, may God help them recognize their abusive behavior and find help to turn their lives around and be instruments of peace. For our community of faith, that we become as compassionate and sensitive towards victims of domestic violence as Jesus would be. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayers. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.
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 Next slide, please.
Amen.
There are some guidelines that I need to share with you as we move into this webinar presentation. This webinar is a presentation, so you will only be able to see the presenters, but you won't see other attendees, but they are here. At the bottom of the screen is a chat function that we encourage you to use to make any comments and ask any questions of the presenters. If you want to send a chat to everyone, change the designation to panelists and attendees. If you want to send it just to the panelists, keep the designation at all panelists. This presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the NBCC website homepage within the next couple of days. So please share this important information with others. The last slides shown today will have a list of resources, which will also be placed as a link on the NBCC website with the pictures of the slides. A link to a very short survey will be sent to you email after the webinar ends. We appreciate your feedback, so thank you in advance for completing the survey. Next slide, please. It is my honor right now to take our time to present to you our panelists and our presenters for this webinar. I'll begin by introducing our facilitator, Dr. Tricia Bent Goodley, and our two panelists, Tony Porter and Dr. Johnny Rice. Dr. Bent Goodley is a professor emeritus of social work and graduate professor in the public health program in the graduate school at Howard University. She has spent over 25 years as a mental health clinician, researcher, and senior administrator with a passion for families and communities. Dr. Bent Goodley served as the founding director of the Howard University Interpersonal Violence Prevention Program, and she is the chair of the Prince George's County Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team. She has developed community and faith-based interventions with a focus on improving the health and well-being of and strengthening Black families. She is proudest of being a wife and a mother of two sons. Mr. Tony Porter is an author, educator, and activist working to advance social justice issues and Chief Executive Officer of A Call to Men. Porter is internationally recognized for his efforts to prevent violence against women while promoting a healthy, respectful manhood. He is a leading voice on male socialization, the intersection of masculinity and violence against women, and healthy, respectful manhood. Porter's 2010 TED Talk has been named by GQ magazine as one of the top 10 TED Talks every man should see. Dr. Johnny Rice, an assistant professor of criminal justice at Coppin State University, College of Behavioral and Social Science, has expertise in the areas of delinquency, victimization, and social justice. Dr. Rice previously served as senior program associate at the Vera Institute of Justice in the Supervised Visitation Initiative. Before joining Vera, he worked as a public administrator for the Maryland Department of Human Resources, overseeing their various programs on family violence and victims of crimes. Dr. Rice held the position of Chief Operating Officer and Director of the nationally recognized Men's Services Responsible Fatherhood Program at the Center for Urban Families, CFUF for short, in Baltimore. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to our facilitator, Dr. Tricia Bent Goodley.
Thank you so much, Dr. Augustine. I appreciate that gracious introduction. So a couple of things that I do want to say and to share with you all. We are talking about a topic that can be really tough. And so we definitely want to encourage you to take care of yourself while we're together. And to also know, because we are people of faith, we approach talking about domestic violence from the standpoint of hope, believing that change is truly possible. So if you need to take care of yourself during this time, we encourage you, please, to do that. I do want to provide a little bit of information about domestic violence before we get started and talking with our incredible panelists today. Domestic violence impacts 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men in this country. On average, nearly 20 people per minute experience physical abuse by an intimate partner. 1 in 15 children are exposed to intimate partner violence each year. Girls and young women between the ages of 16 and 24 experience the highest rates of intimate partner violence. And that's with 1.5 million high school students reporting experiencing abuse at the hands of a dating partner. So this issue is not just an issue that we should be talking about for adults. It's certainly one that we need to be talking about with our children. These numbers have only increased due to the coronavirus pandemic, where we have seen double-digit increases of domestic violence cases occurring all across the country. These numbers are even more sobering in the Black community. So while 25% of US women report experiencing domestic violence, similar studies have found anywhere between 40 to 45% of Black women reporting experiencing domestic violence. We, are 3 times more likely to experience abuse in our homes compared to other women, and 2.5 times more likely to be killed by an intimate partner when we compare to white women. This is a really serious issue in our homes and in our community, but we can do something about it. So I do want to say, what is domestic violence? Someone may be asking that question, what is it? Domestic violence has been defined as a pattern of abusive behaviors that one person uses to control another person. And it can be expressed in lots of different ways. Physical violence, such as hitting, punching, burning, strangling, shooting someone. Sexual violence, which could be forcing someone to have sex or forcing them to have sex with other people. Emotional or psychological abuse, which could include controlling the person's every move, what they do, who they talk to. Stalking the person, threatening to hurt the person. Sometimes the abusive partner might threaten to hurt themselves, the children, or even a pet. Verbal abuse, demeaning language, or isolating the person from family members and friends. Economic abuse is another form of domestic violence. And that looks like denying a person the ability maybe to go to work or to school, doing things that might impact their immigration status, or taking money from them and not allowing them to be able to have access to funds, giving them an allowance or things of that sort. Spiritual abuse is also a form of domestic violence. And that could be manipulating the Bible and scripture to support violence in a relationship. It could include not allowing someone to attend mass. And it could also include abusing the person, and while that person is abusing them, saying, God can't save you. These are examples of what spiritual abuse might include. So I want to reiterate, these are tough topics, but we are accustomed to doing hard things. And we've come to this with a prayer of hope in our heart that we can actually make a difference and change. So with that, I again want to welcome this distinguished panel of men who are here to talk with us about their work, what they've been doing, and give us some ideas of how we can move forward. So with that, I'm going to throw this question out to both panelists. And my first question is, how did you get involved in working around the issue of domestic violence? A lot of people think it's a woman's issue. What engaged you? What made you decide to become involved with domestic violence? And I'll ask Mr. Porter, maybe if you could get us kicked off and started.
All right. Well, good afternoon. It is afternoon across the country at this point, right? Yeah. So good afternoon, everybody. Yeah. Good to be with you all. 20 plus years ago, I was doing work around organizing and awareness and training and education as it related to anti-racism work. We called it Undoing Racism. Knowing that here in the United States of America can also be seen as a race construct, how this country was built and brought together. And we believe that racism was intentionally done so it can be undone. So I worked with a group of people, many still in existence doing their work, undoing racism work. While doing that work, I would be in the presence of women who was looking at sexism. Another form of group oppression. And they began to engage me to really pay attention to sexism and its impact on women. And if I'm invested in undoing racism, then I can really see and guide some of my interest to the experience of Black women. So I became very interested in it. And one of the things that really attracted me was, as a man, I could address these issues with men instead of how we have traditionally have left this, as Sister Tricia was speaking about a woman's issue. We have left domestic violence for women to grapple with on their own. And so that had a lot to do with me getting involved. I believe that you've heard the glaring statistics that Sister Tricia mentioned. I believe that if women could end this epidemic of violence against women on their own, it would only make sense to me that they would have already. While as a minority of men in comparison to the rest of us perpetrating the violence, we can't count on them to be part of the solution, but as men of faith, we are holding out hope for them. But this large majority of men, us, the men that are present on this meeting here, we represent that collective of men who would not perpetrate violence against women and girls. And we're the majority of men, but we're silent, all right? And our silence becomes affirming. So the question that I began to pose to men is, how is it that we, 80% or so of men who would not perpetrate violence, are silent, while this 20%, this minority of men, actually is a lot of men, is a tremendous amount of men, but is a minority of men in comparison to the rest of us. Mm-hmm. And the question for us to grapple with as men, and that's what led to starting my organization, A Call to Men, is how is it that this minority of men are wreaking havoc, an epidemic of violence against women and girls in the presence of all of us men who would never do such. It left a question for us to grapple with. What is it about male socialization? What is it about what we've been taught that it means to be a man that has fostered this epidemic of violence against women and girls? So that led to the work of a call to men. And so, and that's how we got here. We're a national organization that work with men all over the country in many places around the globe, promoting healthy, respectful manhood as a means of increasing healthy manhood, decreases violence against women and girls.
Wow. So powerful. Thank you so much. Dr. Rice.
Yeah. Well, I guess I come to this from a personal perspective and a professional perspective. Personally, I grew up in a household as a child in which my father was abusive towards my mother. And that left a very strong impression on me in a negative way, as well as my sister. My father was an alcoholic. He was physically and verbally abusive to my mother. And he did not demonstrate what we would term responsible manhood or fatherhood. And so we became estranged as I became a young adult for many years. But I also had the opportunity, conversely, to see my father transition from a violent man to a non-violent man. And not only a non-violent man, but a man that was respected by family, respected by community, who was a father to me and a grandfather to his grandchildren. I saw a transformative change that I had never believed would ever occur. And so seeing that change, it moved me kind of from this perspective of being of a place of hatred to healing and to hope. And so that experience I had with my father, God bless him, he transitioned 2 years ago, has influenced how I saw my work. So in practice in Baltimore City, one of the first human services jobs that I had was working as a foster care worker. And our goal as a foster care team was the reunification of children, but the parents had a lot of different challenges, be it financial, emotional, and in order for them to reconnect and get custody back of their children from another relative or from the system, was that they had to meet certain requirements. And I've noticed that many of those families, when I would do home visit with the children or with one of the parents, they would talk about situations and circumstances in which domestic violence was present. So that was one of the first times I actually saw how domestic violence impacted my community in Baltimore, separate from my own personal perspective of living that experience. I would later go on to work with at-risk youth at a place called Edgemead at Focus Point, and they had young people that were suicidal, homicidal, runaways. And as I would counsel and work with these youth in this RTC, these restrictive environments, I would look through their case records and see many of them were subjected to and experienced family violence and domestic violence. I would later go on to work in the prison system as an addictions counselor. It was at Patuxent. And as an addictions counselor, I taught classes in moral problem solving, relapse prevention, one-on-one counseling. So in working with these men and hearing their stories, many of these were offenders that were preparing to re-enter society. They would talk in our groups about their family experience engaging in domestic violence themselves and how they were disappointed because they were actually following a negative pattern that they were exposed to as a child. And the consensus was they wanted more for themselves. So in those three hands-on practice-based experiences, I didn't judge these families because I understood the unique dynamic of domestic violence based on my own experience, but I also understood that there should be pathways for change and that people can, if given the tools, the resources, and the opportunities, become better. And so my focus today has really been on how can men of influence such as Tony, myself, and other men in the Baltimore community and beyond be models of healthy masculinity, but also challenge those men that are engaging in domestic violence so that they can turn away and do better. And the last point I'd make is, when I asked my father, why did you change? Why didn't you relapse back to alcohol? Why did you become nonviolent? And we had, deep conversations about this. He said, the thing that helped me change was my faith. My Christian faith is what made me transition. And so in seeing that, I understand the transformative power of change, but I also respect my father for being accountable and stating the negative things he did and taking ownership of it. So that's what motivates me to do this work, so that children and families can have a better opportunity to survive and thrive.
Wow, that is just so incredible. Just hearing your pathway to this work, hearing Brother Porter's pathway to this work, so critical for us, right? Because we're all challenged in different ways to be called to step up and to serve. So I do want to kind of build on some of what you talked about. You alluded to some of the pioneering work that you've done in the area of fatherhood and domestic violence. Can you talk a little bit about what makes that connection so important to understand for our families, this connection between fatherhood and domestic violence?
Well, one of the questions that I would often ask men, and this was working with men in the prison, working with men later at the Center for Urban Families in the community, what type of father do you want to be? How do you want to be viewed? What do you want your legacy to be? Organization Futures Without Violence has done extensive work looking at this topic of empathy, and as well as with other researchers connected to the Engaging Men movement. And many of those men said that they wanted to be viewed in a positive light by their children. And so domestic violence and other types of abusive behavior are contradictory to that legacy. And so, I mean, it's like yesterday I can remember, and yesterday was really many years ago, but I was sitting in a conference room with the men's services staff at the Center for Urban Families and our CEO, and we were really feeling great about the work we were doing with low-income fathers and families in Baltimore. We were connecting fathers to employment, connecting fathers to mental health services, connecting low-income dads that many people had written off. We would go into the community, engage them, and provide them services so that they were able to contribute to their children's lives in a financial way, but also as a nurturer. So we felt great about that work. And we were starting to get local and national media attention because of it. But as we were starting to get that attention and start to go around the country and speak at conferences about how to engage men, people from the domestic violence movement, advocates, asked us, they said, you're doing great work with men, but how are you addressing the issue of domestic violence with fathers? Now, to be honest, we were kind of dealing with it in an informal way. You know, we had a team of men who would, try to nudge in a positive way, men to do the right thing, not breaking laws, but saying, hey, cut it out. This isn't a thing to do. We're not going to have it. We were getting referrals from our partner program, Baltimore City Healthy Start. There was a maternal women's program, women's and children's program. So we would get insight if fathers were doing some things in the community that they had not been sharing with us in our group activity. But that experience made us step back and say, well, we can't threaten violence to stop violence. And that's not what human service professionals, community-based advocates do. But we acknowledge that we definitely needed to acquire some expertise in addressing this issue of domestic violence by educating ourselves, by partnering and collaborating with people who were experts in this work, and also being able to bring in our men in our program to have the conversation about domestic violence, which somewhat is a taboo issue. So of course, men are quick to talk about gang violence, this more romanticized, or street violence, but not a lot of men are willing to talk about violence towards their intimate partner. So we established one of the first collaborations in the country between a responsible fatherhood program, which we were at the time, and an abusive intervention program through House of Ruth, Maryland. My colleague Lisa Nish and leadership at the House of Ruth, Maryland met with our leadership, Joe Jones and others, the Center for Urban Families. And Lisa and I were tasked to kind of roll it out and make the vision a reality. And just to kind of give you insight as to why we came together, the same men that were being court ordered for domestic violence that were getting enrolled in their program were some of the same men that were also getting contacted and getting enrolled and engaged with us in our program. So we decided that we were working with the same men in the same community. How can we do it in a more holistic way to ensure accountability, not giving them a pass on their violence, but also providing some type of mechanism to get them to support so that they can have the pathway to change themselves. And so through cross-collaboration of training, we got to understand each other's philosophies better. Also through orientation, they allowed us to come in to meet with the men at their site so that we could share with them all the different services that could be helpful to them and their family. They also came to our location to participate in violence prevention groups so that it wasn't just us engaging the men in our program that may have had a history of violence, but it was also making aware men who may have been at risk of engaging in violence, what violent behaviors were and what domestic violence was. So just in summary, that collaboration was great because the House of Ruth, Maryland moved from, they had some aspects where they would shame some of the men in the program, so they changed that based on interaction with us. We understood their philosophy and we were able to refer our men and institute a different type of screening tool so that the men who did not self-report domestic violence, we were able to identify and then refer those men to them by saying, hey, if you trust me, you can trust them. So that collaboration was important because fatherhood is universal. All men who are fathers are not violent men, but it gave us a space because after we helped those fathers get jobs, get educational connections, get mental health connections, they would come to us and say, we love you for helping us do this and do that. Is there anything that we can do for you? What can I do for you, Mr. Rice? Well, I would like for you to attend that violence prevention group tomorrow. Oh, Mr. Rice, okay, I'm gonna come. And so it's establishing those type of relationships and building those bridges using programs that care about our community is what makes that work so important. And so we leaned into the conversation about domestic violence. We didn't step away from it.
Really powerful. And so you talk about how we can use ourselves to create that bridge. And I think about just all of the churches, all of the schools, athletic programs who are engaging fathers as part of this webinar, and just the bridges that they could connect with could be really powerful, the way that you were able to do that as a pioneer in working with fathers. And I think that brings us back to manhood. It brings us back to really talking through manhood. And while I didn't know that Tony Porter's TED Talk was listed as the top 10 TED Talk every man should hear, I think every man and woman should hear it. I didn't know that, but I want you all to know we're going to provide you with a link to that TED Talk at the end of the webinar so you can be a part of that. Tony, you talk in this TED Talk about the man box and just what that is and why that's so important. You've written a book talking about this. This is such a big part of the work of A Call to Men. Can you talk a little bit about the man box and why it's so important for us to understand for our families?
Sure, and thank you. And Brother Johnny, I appreciate all you just shared. But if you don't mind, Sister Tricia, I want to tap on something you shared earlier first, and I won't be long-winded. You gave those stats about Black women, right? And I think for some of the folks that are on with us, if they don't really understand why that is, that Black women are experiencing domestic violence at higher rates, they just may think that brothers are just these inhumane creatures or something or another. And so I just want to tap on that for a second.
Please.
So when you look at our experiences in the United States, which can also be viewed through a lens of being a race construct, right? Black men have experienced tremendous amount of trauma, of course, and so have Black women. But when I'm speaking specifically about the trauma of Black men, we also then know that hurt people hurt people. So that's a variable there. When you look at a race construct and how we then respond to racism, you'll also see with Black men what we call induced self-hate. When all the images and experiences that are coming our way are negative, we begin to digest that. And as a response, you'll see self-hate. The media has coined the term Black on Black crime. We rather use induced self-hate. So when you look at trauma and hurt people, when you look at induced self-hate as a response to marginalization, you can also look at hopelessness and choicelessness. There are a lot of things that you can then, that are part of the experience of being a Black man in this nation that then contribute to our behavior against Black women. Also, when you look at the helping system, though, the system that are supposed to be helping system, human service providers is a huge arena of human service providers, but because of a race construct, we as Black people have a lot of, or lack trust in many of these organizations. We lack trust in law enforcement, which is designed actually to help us, right? Supposed to be to protect and serve, versus our communities, we tend to see more policing. And so there's a lack of trust. So what does that mean? That means that women won't readily call on law enforcement for assistance. And I am talking women and men, and Brother Johnny is going to share with you that men are victims of violence as well. But at the same time, we know the large majority of the violence is perpetrated by men. So there are a lot of factors that come into play as to why the rates of violence are significantly higher experienced by Black women. It's not that we're inhumane creatures as Black men, but the foot of oppression that's on our throats actually contribute to that behavior. And I'm not making excuses at all for that behavior. We still have to challenge that and change it, but we got to know what's going on in order to accomplish that. I just want to put that out. In regards to this man box, the man box is a visualization that we created. What we're really talking about is the collective socialization of manhood. We call it the man box. Is easy to work with men, particularly young men, when we have them to envision a box and then all the ingredients in that box that define what it means to be a man is really easy. It's an easier way to help unpack, deconstruct manhood with young men. But in essence, if I was teaching a course with my brother Johnny there, we would call it what we define it as the collective socialization of manhood. If you look at a box, right, all the ingredients in the box that tend to define what it means to be a man. And while there's some wonderful, wonderful things about manhood and about being a man, you know, men are taught also to view women as less than. Men are taught to view women as objects. And I'm not talking about you as a man. Again, we're talking about the collective socialization of manhood. Men are taught to view women as an object. Men are taught to view women as the property of men. Men are taught to distance themselves from the experience of women and girls to define what it means to be a man. Men are taught that we can't ask for help, offer help, or accept help, because any form of help is viewed as a sign of weakness. And we're taught that women are weak, and we're taught to distance ourselves from the experience of women and girls to define what it means to be a man. So in essence, we cannot acknowledge when we're feeling weak, which actually happens to us often. We're taught, again, in distancing ourselves to define what it means to be a man. If women can share their feelings and emotions, we as men can't. So we ignore our feelings and emotions. We shut them down. The one emotion that we collectively as men give each other permission to express is anger. But because we have limited emotional intelligence, why? Because we don't explore and share our emotions and feelings to learn about ourselves, we wind up having limited emotional intelligence. And so what that also lends toward is, while anger is the one emotion that we give each other permission to express, we don't really know what anger is. And anger is actually a secondary emotion. 110% of the time, it's actually any time we're angry, we're either scared or our feelings was hurt. But when you think about the collective socialization of manhood, the man box, men are not taught that it's okay to say I'm scared. That is okay, it's not okay to say that my feelings are hurt. So there's a lot of limitations that we put on ourselves as men. We're much more robotic than our whole self. We don't leave a lot of space to be our authentic selves. Actually, in a church sanctuary is where I see men the most authentic. But just as soon as we leave that sanctuary and go into the fellowship hall, we're still in the same building. But we go into that fellowship hall and you can see us starting to lock down again, right? So there's not a lot of space for us to be our authentic selves, our whole selves. We're more likely to be a role self. So there's a lot of aspects of this man box, this collective socialization of manhood, that's not only that it's not working for us, but it is really creating this social construct that support violence against women and girls. So while most men don't perpetrate violence, we're silent to the violence. The man box teaches that women are the property of men, right? And most men who are not churched men can tell us that somewhere in the Bible it says that. So there's this belief that the Bible says women are the property of men. Men who are not church will be able to, men who never open up a Bible can tell us that somewhere in the Bible says women are submissive to men. Men are in charge, men lead, head of the household. So she should just do what I say, right? So this is a lot of the, and we all can really tease out the scripture and know it goes much deeper than that. Ephesians 5 is a perfect example. We can tease it out and know it goes much deeper than that. But unchurched men, they just lock on to what works for them. And it's our job actually to help them to understand, you know, Christ has a much huger responsibility for us than for women as it relates to these issues of submission and head of household, etc. So anyway, so this box not only, you know, stifles our growth as men, it also puts these false messages in play that then support violence against women and girls. Because if this box says she's his property, and this is central to domestic violence, the teaching that women are the property of men. And so if she's his property, then he can do whatever he wants with his property. And I can stand by and do nothing, say nothing, right? And I'm not even talking about men putting themselves in harm's way. That's the bystander intervention work. I'm not even talking about that. I'm not talking about you're at a mall and you see a man hurting what appears to be his wife, and then you intervene and you get hurt. That could happen. Intervention is a personal choice. I'm talking about the men in our families. The brother that sits next to me in the pew. Men that I know, that I love and care about, that I know that would never harm me, right? I'm not afraid of them at all. But this man box, this collective socialization of manhood still teaches me that while I see her with shades on, and I can tell she still has a black eye because I can see it at the bottom of the rim of the shades, I know how she got the black eye. So I'm talking to her and I won't even say to her, what happened to your eye? Or are you okay? I won't say anything to him about what happened to her eye. Is she okay? All right. That's what this man box teaches. That's what these notions of women being, and women were the property of men in this country at a particular time in the history of this country. And while that's no longer the case today, it's still tolerated in many of our communities, in many of our places of worship. So yeah, I'll stop there.
I think you bring up many, many topics, and I do see some of the questions coming into the chat section, and we're going to really devote some time to answering some of those questions. But I think about, you know, my two sons who, you know, spent years in Catholic education, pre-K3 all the way up till high school, right? And the tremendous opportunities that we all have to provide education and create awareness for particularly our young men and our boys in these settings that they're in. So I wonder, for both of you, both panelists, if you could just share, what conversations should we be having with young men and boys about domestic violence?
Well, I want to just acknowledge Tony made some excellent points in terms of, and just always hearing about the man box is critical in amplifying that, because it's important for us to have a conceptual framework to understand the behavior and that we see, and also to think about what our role can be, particularly as Black men, to address and account for our own responsibility with our brothers. I think that the conversation, I have a young son who's wrapping up college. Knock on wood. he's doing this thing. I always mess with him, but you know, he will finish. So I think the message and the communication that's important is that men and young men understanding that they influence their peers. And they can have a lot of power, be it on the secondary school level, on the collegiate level, and how they comport themselves, what they present to the public, what they present behind closed doors, is important to who they are in their internal being. All right. And for us as a family, we have the spiritual component that supports the practical things that we pour into our son in terms of what we expect for a young, responsible man to be. He has a younger sister, so it's important that he models for her. So as a faculty member at a historically Black college and university, I'm in a unique position to influence not only my students, but also all students on campus that I come into contact with. One of the things that we echo, not just myself, but other members of our Black Male Initiative Task Force at Coppin State University, which I'm a member, is to look at ways to have meaningful discussions with our young men and older men who are part of the campus community about issues far-ranging, be it COVID, be it social justice, and domestic violence is also an issue that is not going to be overlooked. Fraternities, such as my fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi, clubs on campus, Greek community, all of those leaders, student leaders, are influencers. And so by them understanding and being educated by faculty such as myself as to what domestic violence is, the impact domestic violence has on their victim, the impact domestic violence can have on them if they're being exposed to it, in providing a vehicle for them to report, a vehicle for them to develop safety planning, to be safe. All of those are things that can occur on the secondary and the collegiate setting, but the leaders and the staff and the faculty and the key stakeholders, we have to make sure that we're being authentic and doing constant self-assessment and modeling those things that we would want the young people and the older people who are students at that college to be able to do. You have organizations such as Men Can Stop Rape with Neil Irvin and others who go into these places and spaces and provide the necessary tools and guidance, along with Call the Men and other entities, so that even if those academic communities don't have the expertise within their own counseling department, within their own schools, that the resources and the messages to how the link to those resources are readily available. I tell my son that, you know, he is a byproduct of us, my wife and I, and he represents our family. And he understands that. My daughter also understands that she is a byproduct of us and she represents our family. And we've said to both of them and had a discussion that if someone cares about you, they will not harm you physically, mentally, emotionally, economically. And so it's the same message conveyed to my students. It's the same message conveyed in our campus community. And the last thing I'll say is, as a professor of criminal justice, I love it being at a university because nursing cares about domestic violence. Psychology cares about domestic violence. Counseling cares about domestic violence. Our leadership and administration cares about domestic violence and dating violence. So we can all link up in ways that can be very beneficial. Students can have activities and participate and convene discussions around domestic violence and sexual assault. And the opportunity is there, but the commitment and the guidance from leaders such as us has to also be shared.
Thank you. Brother Porter.
Yeah, so to keep from being redundant, I'm going to ditto everything Brother Johnny shared and just add a couple of other additional things. The whole notion of teaching boys to be their authentic selves is key. And I'll throw a plug, and I know Sister Tricia will put our website into the chat space a little later on. We have an evidence-based curriculum, Coaching Healthy Manhood, Healthy Respectful Manhood, and a lot of information around youth initiatives that we can help folks who are interested with. Is about authenticity, though, at the end of the day. If we could teach boys to be their authentic selves, we are promoting healthy, respectful manhood. If we are promoting healthy, respectful manhood, that in of itself will decrease violence against women and girls. Teaching boys to be their authentic selves will allows boys not to be so focused on the characteristics of distancing. They will be more open to sharing their feelings and emotions. They're more open to asking for help. They will not see women as readily as objects, particularly sexual objects. They're more likely to see equity and equality in relationship with women when they're comfortable being their authentic selves. As long as they are required to be a role self instead of their whole self, they will then submit to those rigid notions of what it means to be a man, and that's the breeding ground for violence against women and girls.
Wow, so powerful. And I hope you all saw that I did put the website information for a call to men in the chat. You'll see it again at the end of our resource slides that will be provided towards the end of our webinar. And I want you to start thinking about your questions as I begin to move towards ending our questions. So I know, Dr. Rice, you mentioned having been a child witness of domestic violence. And, you know, we really wanted to, you know, echo, and I think Brother Porter said this, you know, we know that men are also victims, survivors of domestic violence. So just wanted to ask you, what supports, you know, are available? What should we be doing or saying to survivors, male survivors who've either witnessed domestic violence or have experienced domestic violence?
Thank you, Dr. Ben Goodley. I think one of the challenges is that there are still limitations to resources as it relates to male victims of domestic violence. I've been to many roundtables and conferences where this issue and topic has come up in terms of how to best serve male victims. And there are resources, and there is, networks in different communities, but it's not what I would say any type of national model or cohesive model, similar to the coalitions for domestic violence that exist across the country. But I have seen two things. I've seen coalitions do more work to try to become male-centered or to be able to assist men. But the challenge with that, of course, is some men, there's gender-specific groups within different organizations. And so a male may come to an organization that does not have gender-specific groups and may feel that they don't fit and not show up again. And then you may have providers that may not, may offer service, but the men don't feel comfortable based on the dynamic of the center and the services that they are receiving. What I would say is that there are, in each community, there are generally networks that work with men. And those networks that work with men may be inclusive of abuser intervention programs, responsible fatherhood programs, male involvement programs. And I think the key is to start, you can start with the coalitions in your state and your community, because generally they may have a knowledge of what exists or does not exist. You can look at Office of Male Initiatives and local government to see if they have any male involvement type programs. You can also look within the health departments, because some of these issues won't specifically fall under any one umbrella. It may be under the health department and male health. And so depending upon your state and your jurisdiction, it might be difficult. But generally there are individuals and organizations in each respective community. If they're doing the work, the service community will know who they are, and those referrals can be made. But I would say that the challenge isn't just a lack of intentional services set up just for men, but also you have the challenge of men not wanting to be perceived as non-masculine, men who do not want to be perceived as a victim of any sort. And also you have men who may be in denial and feel as though they're not really in a domestic violence relationship. And so this is an area that I'm still committed to, and there are others who are committed to. There are some national organizations that do work around men and sexual assault, but I think that agencies and entities that provide direct services in terms of counseling are limited. And that's where I think that mobilization needs to occur. And I'm sure even anti-violence advocates and women's movement advocates would also agree. I do believe that there are also some culturally based programs throughout the country that a component of their program may engage men. Asha Family Services is a program that not only works with women of violence from communities of color, but they also engage men and men who have had prison experience. And so the key is being able to identify those type of organizations in your respective community that are invested in providing support services, not only to men that are perpetrators, but also men who have been through traumatic experiences, such as domestic violence and sexual assault.
Thank you so much. I'm going to begin to ask, again, I see some of the questions rolling in, and we're going to try to get to each of these questions. We are getting closer to our closing questions. But I did want to highlight, Brother Porter, the work that you all are doing with athletes, because we have a lot of Catholic athletic associations, leagues across the country. I'm wondering, is there anything that you'd want to share about the opportunity for coaches and athletic directors to get involved in addressing domestic violence?
Yes, that's a great question, and thank you, because they're central to the solution. And why are coaches and athletes central to the solution? When we talk about engaging men, right? As I mentioned earlier, the majority of men are not violent. It's a minority of men who are violent. It's a lot of men, but it's a minority in comparison to the rest of us. As I mentioned earlier, that if women could end this epidemic of violence, and it is truly an epidemic. Sister Tricia gave you stats. What I want to go as far as to say is the Center for Disease Control has said that men's violence against women and girls is one of the leading causes of injury. They put it right on, and they've taken it on as a major health concern. As we know, that's their job, to address health concerns. They have said that men's violence against women and girls is one of the leading causes of injury to women and girls. They put it right alongside of cancer and heart disease, the number 1 and 2 causes of death for women. So it is truly, truly at an epidemic. Why I will go back and say, if women could end the violence on their own, they would have already. And with this minority of men, and so I love how Brother Johnny talked about his dad, because we're not throwing them away, but there was a period of time that he couldn't count on his dad, right? But we have hope for them, and his dad did come around, right? So we do have hope for them. But a bigger focus needs to be put on the majority of men, right? We can really, really have a huge impact if we choose to develop a voice. We've never been asked to talk about this before. Healthy manhood really just meant be a good guy, don't hit your sister, do what you're supposed to do. That's what we taught boys, right? We didn't really get deep. There was never a reason or never language even to talk about, you know, in any in-depth way like we are today about healthy manhood. All right, so we are the first generation of men being truly held accountable, not only for domestic violence, but also to prevent it. This has never been the case before. And preventing it is not about policing, right? That's responding to it. Preventing it is around teaching healthy manhood. And we got to build this plane while we fly it, because the lives of women are at stake. So we don't have like a lot of time to waste. So this whole idea of developing a voice, we believe that athletes, right, and coaches, again, men that men look up to, you know, boys will line up, you know, and wait hours to get inside of a gymnasium and pack it to the hundreds to listen to LeBron James talk about basketball. But what if LeBron James decided, I'm not going to talk about basketball, I'm going to talk about healthy manhood? And these boys are hanging on to his every word. We've all seen, you know, the visuals, and many of us have been a part of it, when at the end of a football game or end of a practice where the coach is standing in the middle of the circle and all the boys are on one knee looking up to him, right? He is the most important person in their lives at that moment. What a wonderful time to talk about something other than football. He has their undivided attention. So men that men look up to, many times we don't even know a coach's name. His name is Coach. And that comes with a tremendous amount of respect. So when we look at the and many of these organizations are hyper-masculine organizations that men look up to for the obvious reasons, because we don't look up to, collectively speaking, we don't look up to organizations that support our teachings of less value, right? But we look up to athletes, we look up to athletic associations and organizations, we look up to coaches. So a big part of our work is to help the sports arena in of itself, the institution of sports, to create this as part of their platform. We work at A Call to Men, we work extensively with all of the major pro sports, National Football League, Major League Baseball, National Basketball Association, the Hockey League, Major League Soccer. We work with them all very, very intimately, because if we can get them to develop, to use their influence, to then create a platform to put their voices in these spaces, we can really expedite this process that we're engaged in. Because when they speak, other men listen. And that's it in a nutshell. At the end of the day, We're trying to expedite this process. And when men who have influence over other men speak, they listen. So for example, if our pastors and priests are putting this out, and our bishops and our imams and our rabbis, and they're all putting this out across their pulpit, men listen. We get faith leaders to really talk about these issues, men listen. They're another, piece of the puzzle, the influence that they have, the platform that they have. So it's not just athletes. There are many men who have influence over other men, right? Military men have influence over other men. When they come home, men gather around them in a circle and want to talk to them about how they're doing. Young men on, traveling home on flights and whatnot. He's just 18, 19 years old. He doesn't know anything about the world, but a 60-year-old man will sit next to him on a plane and bombard him with questions, right? Want to know what, he only been in the military 3 months, but you're sitting there bombarding him with questions because we look up to that. So our work is really to engage men who have that level of influence, to infuse this into their platform, into their thinking, developing a voice, etc. And coaches and athletes and athletic directors, they're very instrumental to this effort.
Thank you so much. I think that really does lead us to my final question, and then we'll dig into some of the questions that we have here in the chat section. And I'm wondering if you could quickly just share, what do you think, what is the role of men of faith in our churches? What role can they play in responding to domestic violence? Maybe give us 2 or 3 things that men in our churches can begin to do to be responsive.
Well, I attend Faith Christian Fellowship World Outreach in Owings Mills. And one of the things that the brothers do there, and I haven't been attending as many groups as I should because I've been a little busy, but that's not an excuse. But there's a monthly there's a monthly men's group, and it affords brothers an opportunity in a confidential way to build off of one another, and it's of all different age ranges. So you have older brothers, middle-aged brothers, and younger brothers. And it's a way to be a support to one another and also to be accountable to one another and to receive feedback around a range of life issues, but using faith to guide the feedback and the recommendations. There's also teen ministry, so there's opportunities to bring the topic into the teen ministry and have guided, intentional discussions about domestic violence and the negative aspects of it, the negative aspects of dating violence. And also there are churches, even beyond mine, that have conferences just focused on men's issues. And in those conferences, you can bring in speakers or have speakers from the church who have expertise in this area to talk. And there's also opportunities to have men who have made the transition from being violent to nonviolent, so they can kind of share and inspire maybe others who aren't staying in the church that they're engaged in that behavior, but are. As Brother Tony said, you could be sitting next to that brother. It goes against the word to be doing behavior that is harmful and destructive to your family. And so I think that the men in the church community and the ministries have an opportunity to be able to make the congregation aware of the issue, but also to have phone drives and clothing drives and to do things to engage the community and use the church as a setting to engage the community in these conversations and training.
Thank
I'm
you.
gonna ditto all of that and just add a couple of pieces on top of that, because all of that Brother Johnny just shared is part of the work. At my church, we also have a domestic violence ministry that I'm a part of. We have domestic violence Sabbath in October, every 3rd Sunday in the month of October. We've been doing it for 12 years. Where we teach about domestic violence, and our pastor preaches about domestic violence in both services. that domestic violence ministry works with the local domestic violence shelter. We advise our pastor, so when he's doing Christian counseling, that he's doing it with an understanding and an awareness of domestic violence. When he's doing counseling for young folks or just folks in general about to get married, he's including that in that counseling. The church is well aware that we embrace women who have been victims of domestic violence, not that we look down upon them. They don't have to keep it to themselves. They know that this is an environment where it will be addressed. We've had members of our church who've had orders of protection against men. We've dealt with that. So we've really embraced the understanding of domestic violence and have engaged and intentionally teach others how to do such. And everything Brother Johnny talked about with men's ministry, our Sunday school classes, our youth churches, the domestic violence ministry does a rotation every year and visited. And we have about, I don't know, maybe about 15 different Sunday school classes and visit each one teaching about domestic violence. And even in this pandemic that we're in, I'm a part of, my men's Sunday school class, we're on Zoom every week. I'm involved in a book club on Thursday evenings. We're reading Dr. Reverend Tony Evans' Kingdom Man. And we're dissecting that book. And I am the agitator, unapologetically. I'm the agitator in the book club, and they know it. But we're dissecting it and we're bringing it to real life and real life experiences from a biblical perspective. And so much of that really includes, our relationship with women. So the church is instrumental. We all know that within the Black community. I mentioned earlier our distrust in so many of the human service providers that are supposed to be helping agents for us. So we come to the church. That's the place that we can trust, is the church. So we really have to be up on these issues, get ourselves trained up. This is a place where it's required for us to have a relationship with the secular community, in my estimation. It's not a church versus state situation. We need to have relationships with the secular community. And this, I no offense to anyone, but I'm beyond, just turn it over to Jesus. I don't think that's what he wants from me, to just to have that notion of we just bring everything to Jesus. Sometimes Jesus is telling us to go talk to somebody else. And I believe in that. And so the church is just instrumental to our communities and to this effort. And if you can get a leader of a flock to shepherd, to really take this on, the church can do magnificent work as it relates to preventing and responding to domestic violence.
Yes, yes, yes. And I want to remind everyone that the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has a statement on domestic violence. We're going to give you a link to that. It's going to give you some examples of things that you can be doing in your church. And I want to echo a couple of things that, you really have to decide what you're going to do in your church community based on what it is, that the resources that you have, the knowledge that you have, the relationships you have with the provider community. So I always say some people want to go straight to a domestic violence ministry, but I know, Brother Porter, you would tell them that's a hefty amount of work. It takes a lot to be able to manage a domestic violence ministry. So for some churches, it might be that you start out putting information in the pews, having your local provider come in and speak, inviting someone that really understands some of these issues and allowing them to speak before a mass or after a mass, or integrating that into a homily. So there are lots of great opportunities for us as people of faith, but we want to make sure that it's in alignment with where we are as a church family. And I want to just say, before we take some of the questions, just how important it is to do it outside of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Some of you know, next month is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We're going to see a bunch of events and a whole lot going on in October. I'm so proud of the National Black Catholic Congress for hosting this in September. It's a reminder to us. Domestic violence happens every single month. of the year. So we want to make sure that we're talking about this, not just during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So with that being said,
I just wanted to add, I just want to add something,
sure,
Dr. Ben Goodley, that you all just reminded me of, even in thinking about this question. When the Center for Urban Families, when I was there years ago, and the House of Ruth Maryland, we had that partnership. One of the things that event we had was a community-based event in East Baltimore. At this event, we had brought together, it was we brought together the community, and we had men and women, but I believe it was primarily men, sign a nonviolence pledge. And our presentation was men giving messages to the community about nonviolence, men who had never engaged in violence, men who had engaged in violence, inclusive of domestic violence, who had changed and these were men who were identified by the House of Ruth Maryland, who completed that program, that had demonstrated substantive change. And so again, the church provided the venue for us to be able to amplify our voice, sign the pledge, and bring attention to the issue.
Thank you so much for that. So actually, I'm going to start with a question that was posed in the chat. I know that criminal justice is another one of your areas, Johnny, so wanted to pose this question to you that came up in the chat. Is there any data that shows that abusers against Black women receive lesser punishment than abusers against white women? And if that's true, would that also be yet another form of abuse?
So while I don't have statistics offhand, I can tell you as it relates to policing, as it relates to corrections, as it relates to judicial decisions, as it relates to juvenile delinquency, there's marked disparity all across the system. I would probably be confident to say that that is the case, but I would not want to just confirm that without having the data in front of me. And one of the things that I've kind of challenged my students on, and it's not just myself at Coppin, but there's other universities that I'm a part of, who are looking at this issue of criminal justice, not limited to domestic violence, but looking at the issue of how to effectively, well, let me just step back and say this. The Quality Education Network, QEM, Quality Education Minorities Network, brought together several HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, to look at how we could best prepare our students to go out into the world of criminal justice, and understanding that they're going to be going into a world where all of these disparities, such as the one that you identified, exist. So what we're trying to do is look at internally, how do we enhance our curriculum to prepare our students to go into these systems that many of us already see are disparate in nature as it relates to people of color, and to affect change, not just birth our students into a system that we all are agreeing has disparities. And so I would probably move towards and confirm that indeed that disparity exists, but the challenge with that is the jury, looking at the decisions that juries make, looking at the bias that certain judges may have towards persons of color. And there has been research looking at prosecutorial trends, and that has validated that there is this disconnect as it relates to the impact on race. But again, the recognition, even if the data shows that, the pushback is you still have individuals that aren't going to accept that that's the reason why. And as a person of color, we know that there's disparate treatment and there's bias in the system, but the systems and some of the systems agents don't believe that. And so you have the data showing one thing, but then you still have a system that's not recognizing or acknowledging that, or even if they recognize it, there's no effective remedies put in place besides maybe removing funding or penalizing someone in an adverse situation where it's very clear that they're being biased. Outside of that, the system as a whole still has not come to terms with the issues around racism. And until that occurs, you're still going to have these type of challenges.
Right, right. So I want to just switch gears a little bit. There's a question in the chat around something that you had mentioned, Brother Tony, about the authentic self. So can you explain what it means to be your authentic self? Are there particular characteristics associated with that?
Yeah, well, again, you know, the man box, the collective socialization of manhood teaches us not to be our authentic selves. It teaches us to work within the confines of this box. We don't share feelings and emotions. We don't ask for help. We don't identify weakness. We're supposed to act like we're tough, like we're strong, like we're courageous all the time. We can't talk about being afraid. You know, these are all or several of, you know, we have to act like women are objects. You know, we have to promote less value in women and how we talk to them, view them. We're not taught to view them as equals and, you know, with equality and equity. All of those kind of things are in this box. Authentic selves means to be who you are, which actually means stepping outside of the man box. Many men are afraid to step outside of the man box because when you're outside the box, you're viewed as to be too sensitive. You're viewed as being weak. When you're outside a man box, the possibility of being isolated from other men, you know, cut off, you know, stereotype, all those fears. So many men are actually being held hostage to it because they really want to be out of it, but they're afraid of being their true selves, right? Being honest with how they feel and how they view the world. They rather work within the confines of how men say we should, so that they're not ostracized or limited or for young men teased and bullied, etc. So being your authentic self at the end of the day really means just being you and not being held to these norms. And so being your authentic, I can say what we see as being healthy manhood, that might not be everyone's authentic selves. Authentic selves, again, is not being tied to these rigid norms, which in many respects may very well be being a healthy man. Expressing your feelings and emotions, right, is a healthy man. The ability to ask for help is a healthy man. The ability to talk about weakness and fears is a healthy man. The ability to stand alongside of women. The ability, this is a good one, an important one also, is when men, you know, in our socialization, we're taught to view women as the object or objects of men, right? As sexual objects, right? Really teaching our boys to have an interest in the experience of girls outside of sexual conquest. Far too often our boys are taught that to have an interest in our men. You can see it with men. You ask a man who's going to college, did he take a women's studies course while he was in college? And most of them will say, no, I haven't. And when they did, they were one of maybe 3 men out of 30 students in that class taking this women's studies course. And when you ask men to make sense of why a man would be taking a women's studies course, we usually come up with 2 reasons. We'll say he's a gay man, which is why he's in the class with women, or we'll say that he's there to meet women, right? Rarely do we say he's there just because he's interested in the experience of women. And when that is the answer, and you share that with other men, when a 21-year-old shares with a group of his friends, I'm not interested in any of the women in the class, and I'm not gay. I'm just there because I just want to learn about the experience of women. That really throws everybody off because it's in direct violation with this collective socialization that you would, because remember, I said earlier, in many cases, we're taught to define manhood by distancing ourselves from the experience of women and girls. That distancing requires a lack of interest. So if a young man is interested in the experience of women and girls, so he's taking a women's history course, right? And of course, there's going to be the majority are going to be women in the class. It throws men off as to why a man would be in that class, right? So being your authentic selves is really going against the grain of how we're told what it means to be a man in regards to our socialization. And you know, I believe this is a Tony Porter thing. There's no empirical data wrapped around this. This is just me. I believe that with all the oppression that women experience at the hands of men, I believe that women, just who they are, they're much closer to humanity. I believe women are closer to how we would define humanity. All you gotta do is go in church. Watch how women embrace the Lord. And somebody might get upset with me, but hey, you know what? I'm unapologetically sharing my truth. Watch the way women embrace the Lord in the sanctuary, and watch the rigidity and the challenges for men to just be free and embrace the Lord, just be free. Women have a handle on that we don't. I believe women are much closer to how we would define humanity. And I also believe that in our socialization of manhood, that's teaching us to define manhood by distancing ourselves from the experience of women and girls, we are in essence distancing ourselves from our own humanity. So authenticity, right? That's about embracing your full humanity.
Powerful. We have I think about 3 more questions that are left, but I don't know if we will get to all 3. I'm being honest. I do want to get this question out. I think it's super, super important. Not saying the others are not, but it gives us an idea of what some of the things that we can do. So one of the questions that came up in the chat, why should you not tell a person a survivor, a victim, why should you not just tell them to leave? And as part of that, the question was, why would someone stay? So any kind of thoughts on that?
I think that from the outside, you know, and I've been probably connected to the movement as an ally for maybe now over 20 years. And I think from the outside, from the most practical thing someone would immediately think is leave. If someone is violent towards you, it makes sense to leave. But when you're from the inside, you know, and from the policy perspective, the practice-based perspective, doing this work, advocates, research side, you know that the lethality is at the highest when that individual is moving to leave that relationship. And I've also, you know, the understanding is, from what I've read, it may take a person up to 7 to 8 times to attempt to leave before they can even make that final transition. So that friend that says, why don't you leave and just walk away, could actually be putting that person in the most lethal situation that's possible. And we also, in taking a victim-centered approach, have to also rely on and understand what is the victim telling us about the situation. And so that doesn't mean that a victim can't leave. There needs to be adequate safety planning and intentionality around that. But what I want to also offer is that years ago, one of the first focus groups I read about was a group of Black, I think it was Black and maybe Hispanic low-income women. It may have been conducted by Futures Without Violence. And they asked these women about abusive relationships that they were in. And one of the central themes that came out of this focus group with maybe like 12 or more women was that even though they wanted the violence to stop, they didn't necessarily want the relationship to end. They wanted help. And so in some communities, as we look around, you're going to have individuals who want to make a decision to stay for economic reasons, for reasons in terms of children, they don't want to leave and move to another community and uproot the children and their socialization, even though they still may be experiencing that violence. But there are a lot of different factors that influence them. They could be fearful because maybe they're here, they're not, here legally. And so there's the fear that they could get deported. There are a lot of different reasons as to why someone may not leave, but the person may choose not to leave. And so the question back to the movement is, well, what do we do and what kind of tools do we provide or survival strategies do we provide to that individual who says, I still love this person, I don't want to leave. So for the people who want to leave, we need to engage them, connect them to the appropriate resources and support system. For the person who wants to stay, we can't discount them either. We have to identify strategies and tools that we can safely get to them so they can cope the best way that they can. But domestic violence is very complex and it runs very deep in terms of some families and their background. And so leaving may not be a safe thing to do immediately. And leaving may not be something they want to do. They may want to see change in that abuser before they exit the relationship. As a victim-centered providers, we have to be respectful of what the victim wants, not necessarily what we think is best.
Thank you, Brother Tony.
Yeah, this is really important. I'm a ditto what Johnny said without going back into that. I will add religious reasons or reasons women don't leave. There are reasons, we live in a dual income society, right? In most of our household, most of us on this call, 2 people are working if you're partners. And if you're single, you know what that means with that one income. We live in a dual income society. What does that mean? When a woman leaves, many women go from middle class to financially poor when they make the decision to leave. Women are uprooting children, right? When they make a decision to leave, leaving community. Women love him. They love him. That's someone they love. They were in love with him usually before the violence started, right? So there's a lot. We need to stop asking women, why don't you leave, first of all, because most of the time, not the people on this call, but a lot of time when we're asking women, why don't you leave, there's a flip question that goes with that then says, so then you're responsible, you're being hit. Why don't you just leave? Far too often translates to, well, it's your fault you're being hit. And we need to really, our work with men, should I say, is we don't ask, why don't you just leave? We ask, why don't you stop? To him, right? Why don't you stop? And to Johnny's point, we need to know what we're saying when we tell women to leave. Because domestic violence is about power and control. And when a woman leaves, he's lost power and control. And 7 out of 10 women who are murdered during or after a separation. So from a danger perspective, we need to know what we're talking about and what we're doing and how we're supporting her when we say, why don't you just leave? Because we still live in a society that views women as the property of men. So we don't have all the necessities in place when we talk about why don't you just leave.
Thank you so much. I want to thank both of our panelists for having us to think, to really think, to dig deep, and hopefully to continue to pray and act, right? To be able to pray and listen to what God is telling you, and also to take that and move that towards action. I think that's part of what we're all called to do. And so I just want to thank you both for answering that call yourselves. I also want to say thanks to the National Black Catholic Congress. Thank you to Valerie. Thank you to Kimberly for having the courage to have this conversation. I'm grateful to you both. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Augustine.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Ben Goodley, Mr. Porter, Dr. Rice. You've given me and all of us so much to chew on and think about. As someone that's worked most of my ministry in youth and young adult ministry, particularly back home in New Orleans and around the country, I see this as an issue that we need to discuss openly and honestly amongst ourselves and amongst our young people as well. So thank you for that. I have no doubt that the knowledge shared today will positively impact our attendees and their families. Thank you again to you all as panelists for taking time to be with us. And I also want to thank all of our attendees today. Next slide, please. So I think as we have all been presented with this information, we are all asked at this time to be presented with a call to action. Take this time to prayerfully consider what is in your heart to do. We ask that you take a stand against domestic violence, to model healthy relationships within your own home and communities. That means where each person can be who God created them to be, in a place of love and respect, and not out of fear and hurt. To consider partnering with your local domestic violence program, to promote learning more and helping those victimized by abuse, and ultimately to be stewards of love, compassion, and hope to eradicate domestic violence. Next slide, please. As we go through these next slides that have resources and contact information that is available for you and your families and friends and communities to learn more. As you note or take pictures of the resources on these next 3 slides, there are some items I would like to reiterate. The webinar was recorded, and the recording will be available on the NBCC homepage, along with links to the resources by the end of this week. You will receive a quick survey by email shortly after this webinar ends. The NBCC uses your feedback to help construct future webinars, so please fill them out, and we appreciate your help.
Thank you, everyone. Have a blessed evening. Thank you for being with us. We hope to see you again. Next month, we're talking about mental health and its connection to faith. So we hope that you'll join us, and we continue to ask God to bless you and your families. Have a great evening. Thank you.
So long.
Thank you.
Have a good one, everyone.
So long.